Caleb Harper had spent 2 long years riding cattle across the endless trails between Montana and the rail towns of Kansas. Every sunrise found him in the saddle, every sunset beneath open skies, chasing one paycheck after another. He had promised himself that every hard-earned dollar would go towards saving the old ranch his late father had left behind. Through lonely nights beside the campfire, he imagined returning home hundreds of times. Sometimes he pictured the old porch with fresh paint. Sometimes he imagined neighbors welcoming him back. Sometimes he even dreamed that the ranch would somehow look better than when he had left. But never, not even once, did he imagine the woman who would be standing on his front porch when he finally rode through the gate. The evening sun hung low over the hills surrounding Cedar Hollow Ranch when Caleb reached the familiar ridge overlooking his property. His horse slowed as he stared down in complete disbelief. The broken fences he remembered had vanished. Every stretch of fencing stood straight and strong, running across the hills like freshly drawn lines. The dry pastures that had once struggled to feed a handful of cattle were now covered with thick green grass. Dozens of healthy cattle grazed peacefully across the fields. Even from that distance, he could tell they were heavier and stronger than anything the ranch had owned before he left. His heartbeat quickened. This can't be my place. He nudged his horse forward, wondering if somehow he had taken the wrong trail. But the weathered windmill still turned beside the barn. The giant cottonwood tree still shaded the front yard. The house still carried the same white stone chimney his father had built with his own hands. Everything was familiar. Everything was different. As Caleb rode closer, another surprise waited. Standing calmly on the front porch was a young woman wearing a faded blue work dress and a canvas apron. She wasn't frightened by the stranger riding toward the house. Instead, she watched him carefully with calm gray eyes, as though she had expected this day for a very long time. She folded her hands together before speaking. "You must be Caleb Harper." Caleb slowly climbed down from his saddle, never taking his eyes off her. "I am." He glanced from her to the house behind her. "And who exactly are you?" "My name is Grace Dawson." Her voice carried confidence, not apology. "I've been taking care of this ranch for almost 2 years." Caleb frowned. "My ranch?" "Yes. I don't remember asking anyone to do that." "You didn't." She met his stare without looking away. "But I think you'll want to hear how it happened before you decide whether I belong here." Caleb had spent 2 years dealing with dishonest cattle buyers, rough cowhands, and strangers who always wanted something from him. Every lesson the trail had taught him whispered the same warning. Don't trust too quickly. Yet something about the woman standing before him didn't match any liar he had ever known. She stepped aside. "Supper's ready." He hesitated. "You cooked in my house." "I've cooked here every evening for 2 years." Caleb couldn't decide whether to be angry or curious. Finally, he walked inside. The moment he crossed the doorway, another shock struck him. The dusty old house he remembered had disappeared. Fresh curtains covered the windows. The worn wooden floors shined. Shelves that had once stood nearly empty now held jars of canned vegetables neatly arranged by season. His mother's old rocking chair had been repaired instead of thrown away. The smell of fresh bread filled the kitchen. For a moment, Caleb simply stood there. He hadn't realized how badly the house had fallen apart before he left. Now it felt alive again. Grace quietly placed stew onto the table. Neither spoke until they were seated. Finally, Caleb broke the silence. "My father died a week before I left." "I know. I buried him myself." "I know that too." He looked up sharply. "Then you know he left me almost nothing." Grace slowly shook her head. "No. He left you much less than you believed." Caleb stared. "What do you mean?" She folded her hands together. "Your father owed far more money than anyone realized." Caleb's stomach tightened. "How much?" "Enough that the bank planned to take this ranch before winter ended." He felt as though someone had struck him across the face. "No. They already had the paperwork prepared." My father never told me. I don't think he wanted you to know. Silence settled between them. Grace finally continued. I came to Willow Creek looking for land after my husband passed away. I had a small inheritance and hoped to buy into a ranch somewhere. She paused. Instead, I heard people talking in the general store. They were saying Cedar Hollow Ranch wouldn't survive another month. Caleb listened carefully. I rode out here intending only to ask questions. What happened? I found your foreman trying to hold everything together with only 2 hired men. Caleb immediately knew who she meant. Old Ben Carter. She smiled softly. He was exhausted. He told me the bank was coming. So I offered him a partnership. Caleb blinked. You what? I invested my own money into the ranch. You invested in my ranch? Yes. He agreed. He didn't have another choice. Caleb leaned back in complete disbelief. You trusted strangers with your inheritance. Grace smiled gently. I trusted the ranch. She looked around the room. I believed it deserved one more chance. Caleb struggled to understand. You didn't even know me. No. So why risk everything? Her answer came quietly. Because sometimes people lose things simply because nobody arrives when they need help. The words stayed with him long after she spoke them. Later that evening, Caleb walked outside alone. The cool September wind drifted across the fields. He wandered toward the barn, touching fresh timber where old boards had once rotted away. The roof had been repaired. The gate swung smoothly. The water troughs were full. Nothing had been ignored. Everything showed careful hands. As darkness settled over the ranch, he noticed an old lantern glowing inside the stable. Ben Carter slowly stepped outside, leaning on his cane. The old foreman froze when he saw Caleb. I'll be. His tired face suddenly filled with joy. Boy, you finally made it home. Caleb embraced the old man tightly. I just got here. Ben looked toward the house where Grace still moved about inside. I reckon you've met Miss Dawson. I have. Ben chuckled quietly. Then you've already met the finest thing that ever happened to this ranch. Caleb glanced back toward the glowing kitchen window, where Grace silently washed supper dishes inside the home she had protected for 2 years. He still didn't understand why a woman he'd never met would spend her savings, her time, and 2 years of her life saving another man's ranch. But deep inside, one question had already begun growing stronger than every other. Who was Grace Dawson really? And why did it suddenly feel as though coming home was only the beginning of the story? Grace's words stayed in Caleb Harper's mind long after the house had gone quiet. He barely slept that first night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the repaired fences, the healthy cattle, the warm kitchen, and the woman who had calmly spoken about saving his ranch as though it had been nothing more than another day's work. Before sunrise, he saddled his horse. If everything Grace had told him was true, he needed to see it with his own eyes. Old Ben Carter was already waiting near the corral, sipping coffee from a dented tin cup. I figured you'd be up early, Ben said. I need answers. Ben smiled. Then ride with me. They spent the entire morning crossing Cedar Hollow Ranch. Every mile surprised Caleb even more than the last. The western fence, once ready to collapse, had been rebuilt with thick cedar posts. The southern pasture had been divided into fresh grazing sections that allowed the grass to recover naturally. The old creek crossing had been reinforced with heavy timber, so wagons could cross safely during spring floods. Every improvement carried careful planning. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing had been done halfway. Ben finally stopped beside the largest pasture. You remember this field? Caleb nodded. It barely grew enough grass for 30 head. Ben pointed across the rolling hills. Count them. Caleb slowly counted. Nearly 80 cattle grazed peacefully. Healthy, strong, worth more money than the entire herd he had left behind. His voice barely escaped. How? Ben looked toward the ranch house far in the distance. Grace. Caleb stayed silent. Ben continued. The first winter nearly finished us. He climbed down from his horse and rested against the fence. The bank gave us 3 months. 3? Ben nodded. They figured we'd fail before spring. What happened? Grace sold almost everything she owned. Caleb looked at him. Everything. Her jewelry. The wagon she brought. Her late husband's watch. Even the little piano she'd hauled across 2 states. Caleb stared. She sold all of it. Ben nodded slowly. Every dollar went straight into this ranch. Caleb looked across the fields again. She never told me. She wouldn't. Why not? Ben smiled. Because she never wanted credit. They rode farther north. Near the creek stood a new wooden bridge. Ben laughed quietly. You would have enjoyed watching her build this. She built it. She organized every board. When the flood washed the old bridge away, everyone said we'd have to wait until summer. But Grace borrowed lumber from the Miller Ranch, talked 6 neighbors into helping, and finished it herself. Caleb shook his head. How did she convince them? Ben grinned. She simply asked. Turns out honest people usually help another honest person. As the afternoon passed, Ben shared story after story. Grace had stayed awake 3 nights nursing sick calves during a freezing blizzard. She had learned bookkeeping from old ranch records until she understood every number better than the bank itself. She had written to farming colleges asking for better seed after insects destroyed one harvest. She had personally delivered beef to nearby towns after hired hands quit without warning. Every problem the ranch faced somehow found Grace standing in front of it. By sunset, Caleb felt almost ashamed. He had spent 2 years believing he alone was sacrificing everything for Cedar Hollow. Meanwhile, someone he had never even met had quietly sacrificed just as much. When they returned home, Grace stood outside feeding chickens. She smiled politely. Did Ben tell you enough stories to last the week? Ben chuckled. I only told half of them. Grace rolled her eyes. He always makes things sound larger than they were. Ben laughed. No. If anything, I leave half out. He walked toward the barn, leaving the 2 of them alone. For several moments, neither spoke. Finally, Caleb stepped closer. Why didn't you ever write to me? Grace looked surprised. I did. You did. Twice. She brushed dust from her apron. Ben found an address for the cattle company. I sent 2 letters. I never heard back. Caleb frowned. I never received them. I guessed as much. You aren't angry. She smiled softly. No. You couldn't answer letters you never saw. Caleb lowered his eyes. I'm sorry. There was nothing to forgive. She continued gathering eggs. I decided it was better for you to finish the trail. There wasn't anything you could have done from hundreds of miles away. So I focused on keeping the ranch alive. Her calmness amazed him. Most people would have complained. She simply accepted what had happened. That evening they ate supper together again. Conversation came easier now. Grace told him stories about stubborn calves escaping fences. Caleb laughed as she described Ben falling asleep during cattle auctions. For the first time in 2 years, laughter returned to the old house. After supper, they walked toward the garden. The evening breeze carried the smell of fresh earth. Rows of tomatoes, beans, pumpkins, and herbs filled the space where weeds once grew. My mother planted gardens here, Caleb said quietly. Grace nodded. I know. He looked surprised. I found one of her journals. It described every flower she planted. I thought she'd like seeing it alive again. Caleb swallowed hard. Nobody had spoken about his mother in years. You brought her garden back. Grace smiled. It felt wrong letting it disappear. They walked slowly between the rows. Finally, Caleb asked the question that had troubled him all day. Why stay? Grace stopped walking. You had every chance to leave. The ranch finally made money. You could have sold your share. You could have started anywhere. She looked across the quiet fields glowing beneath the setting sun. I tried. You tried. The first spring. I packed my wagon. What happened? She laughed softly. I drove halfway to town. Then I turned around. Caleb smiled. Why? Because somewhere along the way. She looked toward the house. This stopped feeling like someone else's ranch. It started feeling like home. Those words settled deeply inside Caleb. For 2 years he had believed home was simply a place. Grace had quietly turned it into something much greater. Over the next several weeks they worked side by side. Caleb repaired corrals while Grace balanced ranch accounts. They checked fences together, delivered cattle together, shared quiet breakfasts before sunrise. Without noticing exactly when it happened, Caleb found himself looking forward to every conversation. Every smile, every evening walk through the garden. Old Ben noticed first. One afternoon, he leaned against the barn door watching them laugh over a stubborn mule. One ranch hand smiled. Think they'll ever admit it? Ben laughed. Eventually. They're both too stubborn. But everyone else already knows. Caleb himself didn't fully understand when gratitude slowly became something else. One evening, Grace handed him a cup of coffee exactly the way he liked it. She had never asked. She had simply remembered. Another morning, she quietly mended a tear in his work shirt before he even noticed it. Small things, simple things, yet somehow they mattered more than grand gestures ever could. Then trouble arrived. 3 riders appeared through the front gate one cold October morning. Leading them was banker Victor Langley. Beside him rode a sharply dressed lawyer. Grace's smile disappeared the moment she saw them. Caleb noticed immediately. You know why they're here? She nodded once. Yes. Langley climbed down confidently. Good morning. I've come regarding ownership of this ranch. Caleb folded his arms. What about it? The banker removed several folded papers. It has come to our attention that Miss Dawson's partnership may not be legally valid. Grace remained silent. Langley continued. Your foreman had no authority to transfer ownership while you were away. The lawyer stepped forward. If these documents are accepted, Mr. Harper may reclaim full ownership. Grace said nothing, but Caleb saw her hands tighten slightly beside her dress. For the first time since meeting her, she looked worried. Langley smiled. I'm sure you'll make the sensible decision, Mr. Harper. Caleb slowly looked from the banker to Grace, then back to the papers resting in Langley's hands. He remembered every repaired fence, every healthy calf, every meal waiting on the table, every story Ben had told, every sacrifice Grace had made without asking for anything in return. Then Caleb reached inside his saddlebag. Very calmly, he pulled out another set of folded papers. I think, he said quietly, before anyone decides who owns this ranch, there's something all of you should read first. Caleb laid the folded papers across the porch railing without saying another word. The morning breeze lifted one corner of the documents as Victor Langley reached forward with growing uncertainty. The lawyer took them first, adjusting his spectacles before carefully reading every page. At first his face remained calm, then his expression slowly changed. He read the papers a second time. Finally, he lowered them. "Mr. Langley," he said quietly, "these are the original management agreements your own bank prepared." Langley's confidence faded. The lawyer continued. "They clearly give Benjamin Carter complete authority to protect the ranch during Mr. Harper's absence." He turned another page. "The agreement specifically allows him to accept investments and partnerships necessary to prevent foreclosure." Langley grabbed the papers himself. "That can't be right." "It is. You prepared these documents yourself 3 years ago." Silence settled across the porch. The lawyer looked toward Caleb. "Miss Dawson's partnership is completely legal. There is no case." Langley's face turned bright red. "You've misunderstood." "No. I've understood perfectly." The lawyer folded the papers. "If this matter goes before a judge, the bank will lose. And you'll likely pay every legal expense as well." For several long seconds, no one spoke. Finally, Langley climbed back onto his horse. "This isn't finished." Caleb met his eyes. "It is. This ranch isn't for sale. It never was." Langley pulled sharply on the reins before riding away without another word. The lawyer offered Caleb a respectful nod before following behind. Only after the dust disappeared did Grace finally breathe again. She looked toward Caleb. "You already knew." He smiled gently. "I rode into town yesterday morning. I wanted to understand everything before someone tried using it against you." Grace lowered her eyes. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." She looked surprised. Caleb stepped closer. "You spent 2 years protecting something that belonged to me. The least I could do was spend one morning protecting something that belongs to you." Grace felt tears gathering before she could stop them. For the first time since Caleb had returned. She couldn't find any words. Old Ben finally broke the silence from the porch. "I've waited a mighty long time to see that banker leave empty-handed." Everyone laughed. The heavy feeling that had covered the ranch all morning slowly disappeared. Life returned to normal. But something between Caleb and Grace had quietly changed. Neither of them spoke about it. Neither needed to. The following weeks became the happiest Cedar Hollow Ranch had known in years. They worked together from sunrise until sunset. Caleb discovered Grace knew every pasture better than he did. She could recognize each cow by sight. She remembered every calf born during the past 2 years. She knew which fields needed resting and which streams stayed full even during dry summers. The ranch no longer felt divided between his work and hers. It simply belonged to both of them. Every evening they walked through the old garden. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they simply enjoyed the quiet together. One cool evening in early November, Caleb stopped beside the old apple tree his mother had planted years before. The branches were nearly bare now. Only a few red apples remained. Grace noticed he had grown unusually quiet. "What are you thinking about?" Caleb smiled. "The first night I came home. When I saw you standing on the porch. You scared me." Grace laughed. "I could tell. I thought I'd find strangers stealing everything. You almost did." He looked at her. "But instead I found someone saving everything." Grace smiled softly. "I never expected you to thank me." "I know. I never even expected you'd understand." Caleb reached into his coat pocket. "I've been thinking about that." He slowly removed a small velvet pouch. Grace looked confused. "What's that?" Caleb opened it. Inside rested a simple silver ring with a small turquoise stone. "It belonged to my mother." Grace's eyes widened. "I had it repaired in town yesterday." She looked back at him. Caleb. He took one slow step forward. I spent 2 years riding trails believing this ranch was the only thing worth coming home for. He smiled. I was wrong. She felt tears filling her eyes. I came home and found someone far more valuable waiting here. He gently took her hand. You saved my father's dream. You saved my home. And somewhere along the way. He laughed quietly. You saved me too. Grace wiped away a tear. You've only known me a few weeks. Caleb smiled. It feels much longer. She laughed through her tears. It does. He looked directly into her eyes. I don't have a fancy speech. I don't have riches. I only have this ranch. And every tomorrow God gives me. He swallowed once. Grace Dawson, will you stay here? Not as my partner, but as my wife. For a long moment, she simply stared at him. Every lonely mile she had traveled after losing her husband. Every difficult winter. Every dollar she had invested. Every sleepless night worrying about the ranch. All of it suddenly led to this one quiet moment beneath the old apple tree. She smiled through happy tears. I was hoping you'd ask. Caleb laughed. So that's a yes. She nodded. Yes. Before he could say another word, she wrapped her arms around him. Old Ben happened to glance through the kitchen window at exactly that moment. He slapped the table loudly. I knew it. The ranch hands rushed outside. What happened? Ben grinned from ear to ear. Took those two long enough. Laughter filled the yard. Grace buried her face against Caleb's shoulder, embarrassed. Caleb simply smiled. For the first time in many years, Cedar Hollow Ranch felt completely alive. They were married just before Christmas. The ceremony was held inside the old barn that had once stood nearly empty. Now it was decorated with pine branches, lanterns, and simple white flowers gathered from neighboring ranches. Grace wore a modest blue dress she had sewn herself. She refused anything expensive. I've never needed fancy things to be happy, she told everyone. Caleb couldn't take his eyes off her. He thought she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen. Old Ben stood beside Caleb as family. Several neighboring ranchers attended. Many admitted afterward that without Grace's courage, Cedar Hollow Ranch would have disappeared forever. After the ceremony, Ben raised his coffee cup. I've worked this ranch nearly 40 years. I watched one family lose hope. And today, I watched another family begin. Everyone cheered. Even Grace wiped away another tear. Years passed. The ranch continued growing stronger every season. The cattle herds doubled. The gardens became famous across the county. Travelers often stopped just to admire the neat fences and healthy fields. Whenever someone asked Caleb how he had managed to save the ranch, he always smiled. I didn't. My wife did. Grace always laughed. We saved it together. Before every sunset, they still walked through the garden where everything had truly begun. Sometimes Caleb would stop beside the old apple tree. He would squeeze Grace's hand and smile. I spent 2 years riding across America trying to earn enough money to save this ranch. He looked at the woman beside him. Turns out, the greatest blessing wasn't waiting inside the house. It was the stranger standing on the porch when I finally came home. Grace leaned against his shoulder as the evening sun settled over Cedar Hollow Ranch. The ranch she had once arrived at as a stranger had become the place where she found a family, a future, and the love she never expected to find again. And everyone who passed through those gates in the years that followed knew one simple truth. Sometimes the greatest homecoming is not returning to the place you left behind. Sometimes it's discovering that, while you were gone, someone else's faithful heart quietly built the home you were always meant to return to.